So really what, again, D-Day itself puts to the test is whether or not modern warfare has reached a new epoch where the, militaries can now operate globally, can sort of land on hostile shores in ways that, just they couldn't during World War I.
It's the Lawfare podcast. I'm Scott R. Anderson, senior editor here at Lawfare, with author and Lawfare contributing editor Michel Paradis.
Eisenhower sees that the plan for Operation Overlord, the plan for D-Day is just way too small. And so he has to figure out a way of essentially doubling the size of the invasion in order to ensure against, a robust German counterattack.
Today we are discussing the legacy of D-Day as we approach its 80th anniversary, as well as his new book, The Light of Battle, Eisenhower, D-Day, and the Birth of the American Superpower. So Michel, you have put together an incredibly detailed, textured historical narrative of a period that I think is in some ways overstudied and in some ways understudied. It is a period that this D-Day and obviously the days leading up to it, that is a crux of American history, world history in a lot of ways. It appears in every major history book, every major World War II text. But the contributing factors that lead to the day itself, the personalities, the decisions, isn't something that I've seen tackled at this impressive level of depth. And I'm excited to dig into it a little bit, because one thing that's really unique about the book, as I've read it, is your effort to really step into the role of people at the time and put decisions and personalities and actions in a context that I hadn't fully appreciated for a lot of these stories, even ones that I was familiar with before I started reading the book. I think you kick it off the book that way, in a way, and that you start it with a kind of dastardly feint, as far as I can tell, where you pull one over on your audience. You open with no apologies for any spoilers, but I don't think you know how the story ends, so I don't think I'm giving a lot away for the audience. You open with a good page or two of pretty action-packed scenes of somebody charging a beach and a beach defense is being stormed. And my assumption when I started reading is like, oh, this is D-Day. We're just getting right into it, and then we'll deal the rest through flashbacks. But that's not actually what it is. It's actually a scene from Gallipoli, another pretty seminal, historically significant maritime assault that kind of hung over all the actors in this era, intersected with their lives in really meaningful ways, even though it happened more than 30 years prior to D-Day itself. Tell us why you opened with that anecdote and what it tells us about how monumental and psychologically daunting, in a way, an undertaking like D-Day was for this community of warfighters.
Sure. Yeah, that was, as you said, there was a bit of a feint or almost a practical joke, I guess, in the first few pages of the book, because, Gallipoli is this invasion that is actually spearheaded by Winston Churchill when he is the First Lord of the Admiralty back in 1915. And Churchill very much sees, as I think almost any sensible person did, very early on in World War I, that traditional army tactics of charging across battlefields is leading to nothing but disaster on the Western Front. And so proposes and then essentially is able to mobilize the government behind what at the time was an entirely novel amphibious landing on the Gallipoli Peninsula in Turkey. And the goal was basically to force the Dardanelles Straits, force Turkey's capitulation in the war, create a ready route for resupply to the Russians, and potentially even expand the British Empire into, where it would ultimately expand after the First World War with the capitulation of the Ottoman Empire. And so it's this, on paper, it seems obvious, right? You just take Gallipoli and then everything is going to be great from here on out, and we can avoid the madness of the Western Front. But what, certainly is a big part of Australian history and as well as British history, it doesn't go as planned. They, are expecting a few thousand casualties potentially over the course of the entire operation, but they suddenly realize that charging across a beach from the sea to land in broad daylight just gives extraordinary defensive cover to the defenders, who can just gun you down with machine guns where you stand. And so very much like, the Steven Spielberg treatment of Omaha Beach, Gallipoli is just a bloodbath across almost all of its shores. And in many respects, it not only replicates the Western Front in terms of literal trench warfare, with the trenches, being in beaches and cliffs, it delegitimizes the idea that you can conduct any kind of amphibious landing anymore. It sort of says basically, look, modern technology has just gotten to the point that, landing from sea to shore in broad daylight has now gone the way of the cavalry charge on horseback. And what D-Day, what we know as D-Day, right, the invasion of Normandy, is the essentially a violation of that well-learned lesson in broad daylight against a far more powerful, far more dug-in enemy, obviously Nazi Germany, who had not only positioned men all along and defensive positions all along the Normandy coast, as the Turks had at Gallipoli, but actually constructed something called the Atlantic Wall. Atlantic Wall in proper German, which involved something like 142 million cubic meters of concrete, all sorts of fortifications. Right, it was this sort of dastardly device designed to chew any human being up who attempted to land on hostile shores. And the D-Day invasion is essentially, can we either learn the lessons, or are we doomed to repeat the lessons of Gallipoli? And that loomed huge in British minds. The British really never come around to Operation Overlord until really almost the very end. Winston Churchill, in particular, opposes it and repeatedly speaks of, I imagine the channel running with blood. And so really what, again, D-Day itself puts to the test is whether or not modern warfare has reached a new epoch where the, militaries can now operate globally, can sort of land on hostile shores in ways that, just they couldn't during World War I.
So this point of context, which you tie to the professional careers, not just of Churchill, but of George Patton, of Eisenhower, the main character, the focus of your book, of a lot of these other people, really underscores the methodological choices you make. Would you describe in a kind of post comment at the end of the book, a note at the end of the book, but I want to bring out here up front, which you made the point that Dwight Eisenhower, is a difficult person to study, in part because we have such an inherited vision of him, in part a product of him just being president and a prominent figure and getting lots of kind of cursory or somewhat less deep treatments by historians who might not be interested in the historical truth as much of a narrative, and in part as a matter of construction by his brother, a prominent academic and intellectual himself, Milton Eisenhower, who kind of takes the lead on building his public image, even as D-Day is kind of entering the final stages of preparation, and when Eisenhower really becomes kind of a national, international figure. And instead, you take this opposite track. You really started more at the grassroots level and then built up from much more granular accounts of what he was actually doing day to day. Tell us about your methodology, why you pursued it, and exactly what you think you gained out of that, or the reader can gain out of it by this very different book that you've produced.
Yeah, thanks for noticing that, because this is an area that's so well trod. I can't even count the number of books about D-Day. And Eisenhower, what drew me to the project was ultimately really more Eisenhower than D-Day itself, because I'm not going to pretend I can tell the story of landing on Omaha Beach better than a lot of my predecessors. But the story of Eisenhower fascinated me because here you have someone who is the most powerful general probably in history, who was raised by religious pacifists in Kansas. He's this guy who mounts the most complicated, intricate military operation, high-risk military operation in all of history, which is the D-Day invasion, where they're estimating that anywhere from a quarter to half of the men who are going to hit the shores might be lost. And his backup plan, if he ever fell out of the army, was going off to be a gaucho in South America, in Argentina. He's someone who, and this I discovered sort of in the course of it, is warned ahead of D-Day that the Germans are developing nuclear weapons and very well might be planning to use them on D-Day. But he's also told there's nothing you can do about it and you can't really tell anyone. And so then he, focuses on, how am I going to prepare for the weather? And he just seemed like such an interesting, fascinating character, almost with as many contradictions as America itself, that I almost couldn't resist wanting to know more about him. And I felt that he had been done a profound disservice by his own narrative that he very much sold as part of his own sort of nascent political career of being, probably one of the trying to look as boring and, as dumb as possible. Right. Anytime anyone ever asked him, what he planned for his future political career, he said, well, I just plan on going fishing, somewhere and hoping to get some rest after this war's over. So that intrigued me. It really, made me think that we don't understand him. And he's such a consequential 20th century figure that I felt that the failure to understand him really was both a disservice to him, but also was probably leading us to misunderstand how power really works, how people, particularly someone with his kind of very strange background, ultimately can rise up the ranks and become, literally one of the most powerful people in all of American history. And so I decided to sort of eschew as best I could a lot of the certainly standard books and biographies and just go to his day planner. In addition to putting together a lot of his individual life just with the primary sources, and particularly his early life. But for the crucial period that we focus on in this book, which runs from about November of 1943 up through June 1944, I basically was able to find in the archives his day planners and tried to, just reconstruct his day-to-day life as best I could using his cable traffic, using, contemporaneous diary entries from people he was meeting with, you name it. I think I altogether went through about 80,000 sort of just primary source documents in trying to reconstruct this idea so that you could, sit there in a sense, as a fly on the wall with him as this was all unfolding and really understand what was happening as opposed to, the story we tell ourselves as to why, this great D-Day comes off. And so methodologically, I tried to sort of, again, just focus on really understanding day to day what he cared about, what bothered him, who bothered him, what his opinions of different people were, and how they interacted with him, and what their opinions of him were, which again have often, with the sort of soft light of history, become much more nostalgic and pastel colored than how people certainly would have described him to one another at the time. And so that was my method, was to really try and understand him, in a new way, right, with fresh eyes, and try and understand how this very strange character with a very unusual personal background ends up rivaling, Sir Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt and all of these other major figures of the period.
And the end result really is an exceptional read. Like, you end up with this day-to-day TikTok put together in very pleasant to read prose. So I'll give you full credit for that, not Eisenhower and his daily journals, I assume. That is incredibly detailed. I mean, it really does remind me like of a Doris Kearns Goodwin, Team of Rivals, or Bully Pulpit type books, histories, which I quite like because you really get this nitty-gritty sense of how what seem in hindsight these historical events came about, were contextualized, what did and didn't seem significant at the time. It's in my mind such a valuable tool for piercing these hagiographies we have that build up around these seminal figures that you need to understand why they did and how they did things the way that they did. And meanwhile, intermingle with that, you do have these historical flashes, these biographical snippets that dip into Ike's pretty unusual and interesting childhood and upbringing. You hinted at this a little bit already, but tell us a little bit about what you think are the big themes from his early childhood that ended up informing and make him such a different historical figure than a lot of people appreciate at the time, certainly, and might even appreciate now.
Yeah, so compare him really to his contemporaries, right? People like Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, who literally grow up in their country's respective nobility and rise to power almost inevitably in many ways. Like, it's very easy to understand how they rose to power by being essentially the most talented of the talented and well-connected people in their societies. Whereas Eisenhower is the middle child of, a fairly poor family in the center of the country, Abilene, Kansas, which is, at the time, the middle of nowhere, is at most nostalgically remembered as the old, part of the good old West, the wild old West. And he's raised by this, his two parents. His father is, an extremely difficult man by all accounts, is quite physically and emotionally abusive, as we would say today, to the point where he actually gets arrested in 1898 for beating up a neighbor's child, which is kind of, tells you something, right? That's a serious in 1898 in Kansas, right? To be arrested for essentially child abuse really does tell you something about the kind of man he was. And Eisenhower's father was also a very fanatical type figure. Eugene V. Debs actually comes through Abilene when Eisenhower is in his early adolescence, and Eisenhower's father becomes essentially infatuated with Eugene V. Debs. Becomes an ardent socialist, runs for local school board as a socialist, earns, I think, about like 7% of the local vote for that seat, and is just a very difficult man in a lot of ways. And his mother is sort of the opposite. His mother, by all accounts, including Eisenhower's own, is one of those people who is just has the infinite patience that a mother of 5 boys would have to develop, and it's certainly where Eisenhower gets his sort of famous big broad smile. But it was a really strange and difficult childhood. And I say strange very, very cautiously, but his parents became followers or sort of part of the movement that was at the time called the Bible students. We call it today the Jehovah's Witnesses because ultimately it becomes much more institutionalized. But in the turn of the 20th century, the Bible students were, to put it bluntly, a millennial cult. They were convinced that the earth was preparing to end, the world was going to end in 1915. The reason they predicted that as the date was because the founder of the Bible Students movement, Charles Taze Russell, looked to essentially the geometry of the pyramids and used the geometry of the pyramids to essentially show that God built the pyramids in order to predict the future. Probably the most prominent item in Eisenhower's very small boyhood home, which is still there, although this item is not, in Abilene, Kansas, was essentially a wall-sized diagram of the pyramids and how the pyramids predicted various moments in biblical and then political history and why the earth was due to end in 1915. And this essentially covers the wall of his childhood home. And Eisenhower retreats in this environment to books and to history. He gets some of his earliest mentors in a local newspaper publisher who sort of sees Eisenhower's curiosity and cultivates it. He gives them a copy of The Life of Hannibal, which Eisenhower's deeply pacifist mother immediately takes away from him and hides in a closet that Eisenhower then has to break into at nighttime or when his mother's out in the garden to read Hannibal's exploits. And Eisenhower ultimately, takes the test and essentially applies and takes the test and scores highly, so he's able to go to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And it's almost, to put it in as strange as it may sound, his way of rebelling, his form of rebellion against this, sort of pacifist upbringing from his parents is to go to the military academy and not only serve the U.S. government, but serve the U.S. Army. And so it's there that he really begins to develop his own sense of himself. He kind of wears being from Abilene as a source of pride, right? He takes on a certain cowboy swagger. He's quite a football player, although blows out his knee and ends up coaching, and essentially rises through the ranks of the Army through a combination of skills. One is coaching football, because at the time the Army cares awful lot about coaching football, and there are teams all over the country, and so Eisenhower really distinguishes himself as a football coach, which he would also identify as probably the way he learned to lead people in battle. But he also distinguishes himself by cultivating mentors and cultivating powerful mentors. And that enables him to essentially climb the ranks of the military by being not so much a chameleon. I don't think that would be fair to him, but as someone who is known as so-and-so's guy. And so that includes people like General Moseley, who was sort of one of the great sort of racists, frankly, of the 1930s, who in turn enables Eisenhower to get into the inner circle of Douglas MacArthur. And then he's MacArthur's guy. And then he eventually sours on MacArthur in the Philippines after almost a decade and comes to Washington under sort of very lucky circumstances and very quickly becomes known as Marshall's guy, to the point that Roosevelt's nickname for Eisenhower was Curran, because Roosevelt would give nicknames to his inner circle based on the house staff at Hyde Park. And Curran was the assistant of the groundskeeper, a guy named Plog. And Roosevelt had given Marshall the nickname Plog. And so Plog's assistant was essentially how the president knew and understood Eisenhower, almost up until the time he appointed him to be the Supreme Allied Commander.
So those two figures you just mentioned loom really large in Eisenhower's life and career, particularly the most seminal stages of it, which I find very gratifying in this book, don't appear to start till he's about 40 years old, which is phenomenal news for those of us who may have celebrated certain birthdays. It really does. Yeah. So MacArthur and Marshall are these two figures that really seem, at least in the narrative, draw like pretty polar opposites in a lot of ways. And that's, I think, consistent with how they've been framed in a lot of histories and probably is very true to form. Tell us a little bit about what he gets from them professionally, not in terms of advancement, but sense about the role and the appropriate way of approaching a task like being a military commander, and how they feed into the position we find him at the outset of this book, which is where he is the head of Mediterranean forces, has experienced a lot of success in the Mediterranean, and is on the cusp, but has not yet reached the point where he is in charge of what will become D-Day, but is instead sort of kind of waiting on his next moment. What are the secrets to his success up to this point? Where do we find him at the beginning of this narrative?
Sure. So, his one of his secrets to success was that he learned. He really did, and he was one of those people who I think I mean, I don't want to get. I'm not putting him on the couch, but I think growing up in a very doctrinaire household with a father who was very certain about everything allowed Eisenhower, almost as a reaction to that, to always have a flexibility of mind that served him incredibly well, both in being a very good subordinate, which I think is an underrated virtue. Certainly outside of the military, it tends to be an underrated virtue, but also in learning from his own prejudices and mistakes over time. So he starts working for MacArthur, for example, in the early 1930s. And at this time, Eisenhower is basically a fan of Mussolini. He, like a lot of people in that time, sees American democracy as kind of a mess and thinks that the United States and most countries around the world would benefit from having a much stronger leader who's willing to take charge and do what's necessary to get things done. And so almost naturally falls in love with Douglas MacArthur. And because Douglas MacArthur at this point is sort of one of the great eminences of the military. His record at that point is sort of sterling. And he has that just feral charisma that we recognize in strong men, but also charismatic leaders like Winston Churchill, right? Who have the ability to move people to think that they are on some grand crusade, that they are there as part of something much bigger and broader than anything that, simple common people in the world could ever really understand. And so Eisenhower spends much of the 1930s with MacArthur, and MacArthur ultimately leaves the army. This is in Manila, mostly in the Philippines. And MacArthur is one of those people with great talents and great energy, and he becomes incredibly destructive when he has nowhere to put it. And so as a consequence, he becomes increasingly a bit like Kurtz from The Heart of Darkness, and he just enjoys sort of nursing all of these spoils he's getting from the Philippine government. He ultimately retires from the army, has himself declared a field marshal of the Philippine army at a salary of several $1 million a year, is living in sort of these grand suites. And Eisenhower increasingly sours on MacArthur's paranoia, his megalomania, his essentially laziness, right? He's unwilling to actually do the hard work that he's supposedly there doing. And, at that point in his career, making you feel better about being in your 40s, right? He's at his end of his 40s and he thinks his career is basically over. He just wasted his, time with MacArthur as he kind of understands where megalomania inevitably leads. And it's sort of through luck that he ends up picking up, he ends up getting brought to the Pentagon to work for Marshall. And the same essentially human personal skill set that he brought to working with MacArthur, he brought to Marshall, which is, what does this guy want? How can I give it to him? And how can I, in a sense, keep my own ego and ambition in check so that I can be as of the most use to him as possible? And this serves him incredibly well because Marshall finds that he's, not only a workaholic, which he is, but that he's incredibly focused, incredibly humble, and that Marshall doesn't have to worry about him the way Marshall worries about a lot of the other generals who all of a sudden, find themselves being featured in Life magazine and getting these glowing profiles, and all of a sudden, feel their heads swelling, which Marshall really does not like in his subordinates. And Eisenhower has this, not entirely put on, but he certainly overemphasizes this kind of, I'm just, humble like from Kansas affect that allows people to really trust him, including Marshall, to trust that Eisenhower is actually in it for the right reasons and working toward the goal, not working for himself. And so that's how he ultimately gets picked by Marshall to go essentially lead American forces first in London and then to act as the benevolent monarch is how some people, certainly the British, described him in the early Allied campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, where the strategic direction of the war is very much being dictated by the British. But in order to maintain the strength of the alliance, the British certainly need the United States, if nothing else, for manpower at this point. Eisenhower is sort of put at the head of this operation and understands in that situation, just as he had with MacArthur and then with Marshall, that the most effective thing he can do is make it about the mission, not himself. And that in turn, makes him, I think, a real true believer in multilateralism, right? He is probably the best and almost the essential glue of the Atlantic Alliance in that first year of the war, so that by the time the Cairo conference comes around, he is not the most respected military commander of the war, to say the least. But he is universally liked and universally appreciated, which I think is one of the main reasons why Roosevelt ultimately does elevate him to take on this massive task of the D-Day operation.
We've mentioned MacArthur and Marshall, these two figures that loom really large, to the point that really throughout the period covered by this book, we see Eisenhower writing in almost deferential terms to Marshall. You kind of describe him being nervous about Marshall's perception of him and concern in a way that seems strange for a figure who we kind of put at the top of the hierarchy, but didn't feel that way at the time, to him at least. A third figure that looms really large throughout that we touched on already, but I want to zoom in on, is Churchill himself. Looms very large throughout the war effort, but also in this narrative with Eisenhower, to the point that Eisenhower, when he's considering writing his own book about this chapter, which he does eventually do, but under a different title, the title he originally considers is Churchill and Marshall, or Marshall and Churchill. I can't remember which order it was. What does that relationship tell us a little bit about how Eisenhower approached these issues with foreign allies, which, as you note, is a situation where Eisenhower is carefully balancing a lot of equities and this kind of difficult moment about British guidance and Britain being in the early on, particularly a lead position in the conflict, that gradually begins to give way a little bit as Eisenhower and others, but particularly as Eisenhower kind of steps into these leadership roles.
Yeah, it's a really interesting. He does. He actually never publishes this. The memoir, the draft memoir that I was referring to that I referred to in the author's note, is essentially some notes he took. Towards the end of his life, he would dictate into a dictaphone sort of ideas for books or chapters for books, and so was really reflecting at the very end of his life a lot on this period that I ended up writing about. And as you said, entitled this chapter "Churchill and Marshall," because I think that is, without again putting him on the couch, I think that's how he viewed himself, right? Here are these two major figures who have very different visions of not just how the war should be fought, but, really how the world should work. So you can also include within Marshall someone like Franklin Roosevelt, right? Who had a very different vision for the post-World War than Winston Churchill did, and particularly in terms of decolonization. And so one of the main struggles on every level, like personal, even at times physical, and certainly political struggles that Eisenhower has in the lead up to the D-Day invasion, is navigating this alliance. And, the number of flashpoints that put the Atlantic alliance at risk are almost too numerous to count, but I'll just name a couple. One is that the United States very much was primarily interested as a political matter in the Pacific. And so the European war was always going to be a political liability for Roosevelt, particularly in a presidential election year. The British very much saw the war as almost a continuation of the First World War, and certainly a continuation of its long imperial hegemony over international and diplomatic affairs. Right at the time, certainly when the war starts, and during and throughout the war, that Great Britain and the British Empire make up about a quarter of the world's population, 20% or so of the surface of the Earth. The Royal Navy has a port of call on every continent, controls the seas, and had done so for the previous century, leading to grandiose ideas like the Pax Britannica. And so for the British, right, the idea that this American upstart might have its own ideas about politics were simply an essence of the United States and Americans being naive. But you also had deep cultural flashpoints between the British and the Americans. Certainly as Operation Overlord was being mounted, you had about 1.5 million Americans flood into the British Isles in advance of D-Day. And all sorts of aspects of American culture graded quite hard against their British hosts. Probably the most divisive, and the one that ended up taking up the most of Eisenhower's time, were things like civil rights, what the British called our color problem. Because at the time, the army was segregated, and Great Britain just did not have that. They almost just couldn't understand why we imposed this kind of violent racial caste system in the United States. And so when we brought that, in essence, to Great Britain, it was a constant point of diplomatic friction between the British government and the United States government. And so Eisenhower is between all of this. And I think one of the main reasons he gets the job, and I spent an inordinate amount of time trying to understand this, is because Roosevelt understands or gets that this is a political position more than anything else. The great meeting of the Anglo-American powers in Cairo in 1943, in December of 1943, is where there is, essentially a coming to terms between the Atlantic Alliance. You have the British on the one hand, adamant that the Allies should continue to press their advantage in the Mediterranean, which had been British strategy from the beginning of the Anglo-American Alliance in 1941. But the Americans saying, no, the time has finally come. We need to invade France and take the fight directly to Germany. And the British are opposed to this for any number of reasons. Some good, such as Winston Churchill's fear of a bloodbath, but some just pure political, because the British Empire sees the Mediterranean as, ripe for the picking, and certainly has an interest in cutting off the Soviet Union from expanding its sphere of influence in the Mediterranean. But the Americans are also now producing, 7 times as many ships, twice as many planes, 3 times as many tanks. And so there is this, real conflict for the first time between equals. And the result is a compromise. But to get to that compromise are some of the just most sort of vicious, angry summit meetings that I've ever read about. At one point, Sir Alan Brooke, who's the British Army Chief of Staff, and George Marshall nearly break out into a fist fight during one of the conference meetings on the allocation of landing craft. And one of the things that Roosevelt complains about privately during this time is that he's having to play referee between the British and the Americans. And so when he ultimately has to make a choice about who's going to be the Supreme Allied Commander, I think there are a lot of reasons, and he gave a lot of reasons to different people, but I think a big one was that he saw that Eisenhower could manage this relationship, that he had that sort of political touch to be able to navigate the rise of American power and sort of the growth of American influence, particularly right in the heart of the United Kingdom, without overly antagonizing the British any more than he had to. And he did. He had a incredibly warm relationship with Winston Churchill that lasted till the end of their respective lives. They met for lunch, at least once a week. Churchill would throw these epic dinners that would go into the wee hours of the morning, where Eisenhower would dutifully attend until he was completely exhausted. And as a consequence of that, Churchill trusted him. And that it's hard to overstate how important that was when you're dealing with, really tense conflicts over not just, troop movements and the size of a military operation, but things that go to the core of certainly British national prestige, as well as, America's sort of burgeoning rise in the world. And Eisenhower is able to make America seem benign to the British in a way that I think someone like George Marshall could not. And the last thing I'll say about it, too, is just that I think also Eisenhower, I think certainly towards the end of his life, when he was looking back, you get this strong sense. But he also, just as he had cultivated mentors, throughout his life, whether or not it was, George Marshall or Douglas MacArthur or many others who I write about in the book, Churchill kind of becomes a political mentor to Eisenhower. And it's being sort of at Churchill's side in London in early 1944 that, Eisenhower not only comes to prominence as, a much bigger celebrity than he ever was, so that his name does start getting bandied around as, a future presidential candidate, but he watches Churchill closely and watches how he uses and sort of deploys political power in the British government, and in ways that, Eisenhower remembers really throughout in his entire life, and then goes on to deploy himself once he's president. And so it's this really interesting window. This relationship between Churchill and Eisenhower does give you this really interesting window into, for lack of a better phrase, the portrait of a president as a young man. He's in his 50s, but he's still, he's not quite yet the, major American sort of political force that he obviously ultimately becomes. And it's in this period that you see him, developing that touch for retail politics. And a lot of that he learns directly from Winston Churchill.
So by this point in the narrative, Eisenhower is the head of Operation Overlord. He's the person in charge of the strategy for retaking Europe. And a big part of the book, really the middle 200 plus pages, is spent on the preparation for this event, which is a task so complicated with so many moving parts. You really need the space to do it. I mean, you do, I think, yeoman's work getting into the nitty gritty and pulling out a lot of these debates and the personalities and human side of a lot of these debates that come into play, which would prove instrumental, really, in the ultimate success of D-Day, despite the heavy cost. Let's zoom in on two that jumped out at me as particularly notable. And the first one is about the concept of air power, which was particularly important in kind of preparing the ground for eventual D-Day invasion, and particularly debate over Operation Point Blank, which was a kind of alternative use for the air power. Tell us a little bit about how Eisenhower approached this issue, the situation he encountered when he first came into this leadership role, and how he eventually was able to navigate it to the outcome that we see come June 6, 1944.
Yeah, so this is, in a sense, where Eisenhower begins to understand the military-industrial complex. And it's primarily because the Air Forces, which is still part of the Army at the start of World War II, has its own theory for how to win the war. And to summarize it, too crassly, I'm sure some of your listeners who are going to be much more deep into this will cringe at how much I simplify this. But the Air Force basically proposed that they could win the war against Germany simply by bombing Germany to the Stone Age, right? The idea being that if you can cut off Germany's industrial base, cut off its ability to refine fuel and make airplanes, Germany will just have to surrender because they will just have ceased to lose the wherewithal to continue to fight. And this rises to the level in both British and American sort of air power circles to almost an article of faith. And so that's what Operation Point Blank is. In early 1943, Britain and America essentially give the strategic bombing power, the strategic bombers under their respective command, the ability to carry out these airstrikes against Germany basically day and night with an effort to knock Germany out of the war through bombing alone. And Eisenhower comes into Operation Overlord seeing that the real danger he faces is not even on the beaches on D-Day itself, although that danger is expected to be enormous. It's the question of buildup. Can they get enough men across the English Channel to counter a German counterattack? Because at that point, the Germans have about 500,000, German soldiers throughout France and Northern Europe that they can redeploy to Normandy to meet any invasion within about a week. And so they have this problem of, there's a race going on. And so Eisenhower picks up a proposal that comes from his planning staff to basically destroy the railway lines and roads and railway terminals primarily that leading into Normandy so that the Germans can't use trains. In essence, they have to go over, muddy ground in order to get to Normandy, which will hopefully slow them down. And proposes this and meets immediate resistance from the Air Forces, who see that anything that comes at the cost of essentially their theory of the war, right? Their belief that if they just can keep bombing Germany into the Stone Age, that eventually the Germans will just have to quit. That anything that sort of takes them away from that task is a total waste of their time. And Eisenhower is essentially put in this very awkward position of not actually having command over the Air Forces. And so a lot of the stress that sort of dominates his life in the early months of the planning of Operation Overlord is trying to get the Air Forces under his own control so that he can direct them to essentially helping to prepare the ground for the Normandy invasion. And it's a real, it's a political fight because and it's a recognizable fight, which is what I think made it so interesting to write about, is because you have genuine different theories, right? Different theories about how we're going to win the war, how we're going to advance America's national security prerogatives. The people like Marshall and Eisenhower tended to look, pretty skeptically at the Air Forces who, if you think about early 1940s, right, this is a time when air power is novel, right? It's the hot technology. It's kind of like people at today arguing for cyber or AI. They very much are, they believe themselves at the vanguard and they think all the old rules of war no longer apply. And not for nothing, they can rack up enormous budgets in a very short period of time because of how expensive this new technology they're attempting to deploy is. But then on the other side, you have people like Eisenhower and George Marshall who, see air power, who are army men, right? Traditional soldiers who do, fundamentally believe, look, history stays the same more than it changes. And at the end of the day, you have to put boots on the ground in order to defeat an enemy, and that the Air Force's sort of hypothesis about how you might win a war in the future is at best an untested hypothesis, and at worst is a grand illusion. And so it's this intra-bureaucratic fight where you see both sides almost pull out every tool at their disposal, such that at one point, the air forces, in order to sort of continue their bombing campaign against Germany, begin to foster worries in the British government, particularly over how many French casualties are being caused by the bombing of the transportation networks, which were huge and significant, right? We're ultimately talking about tens of thousands of Frenchmen are killed in these bombing raids. But you see this kind of intra-bureaucratic warfare over how the future of national security in our respective countries, or how the future of war should be fought. That is both, fascinating from an internal politics standpoint, and also just fascinating because it looks so familiar to the kinds of things we deal with every day today.
It's just an absolutely fascinating part of this discussion, and the degree to which the sometimes vision we have of the field commander as the ultimate decider is sometimes not being reality, and having to be willed into reality by the people trying to assert a particular strategic view. It's an interesting story. We see that in play again at a higher level in a lot of ways, at a higher international state to state level, in the broad debate over the overarching strategy in Western Europe, particularly after we see the Mediterranean theater become a bit of a slog and change the resource picture. And that, of course, boils down to the pretty well-known debate, at least among people who study this era, between Operation Overlord and Operation Anvil, which were once envisioned to be kind of two simultaneous invasions of Europe that are ultimately pared down to one, just Overlord in Normandy. Tell us a little bit about that question, the reality of having to deal with the fact that the original strategic vision that had been signed off by the Allies had changed, and navigating the picture to, as you know, what you've already described as what was, from the British perspective, kind of the worst case scenario, or the thing that they were most afraid of, which was a cross from the English Channel being the ultimate strategy that was adopted.
Yeah, so a big part of this debate is the fact that when Eisenhower actually gets command of the D-Day invasion and reviews the planning more closely, and this is planning that had been agreed upon by the Allies at Cairo and previously in the conference at Quebec, and he reviewed the planning and the basis of the compromise that had been struck at Cairo, where the British would continue to lead operations in the Mediterranean, and they would essentially divide their forces, and then in order to conduct Operation Overlord, Eisenhower sees that the plan for Operation Overlord, the plan for D-Day, is just way too small. And so he has to figure out a way of essentially doubling the size of the invasion in order to ensure against, a robust German counterattack, which he, at that point, having conducted the operations in North Africa, Sicily, and at Salerno in Italy, he knows that the Germans can put up much harder fight than many of the planners, I think, had anticipated. And just to show you how he deals with this problem is because he knows for sure that proposing a doubling of Operation Overlord will meet immediate British resistance, because the British don't want to do it to begin with. And as a consequence, will probably take the opportunity to say, look, well, we may as well just refocus all of our efforts in the Mediterranean. And so seeing this problem, he understands that the proposal to double the size of the operation can't come from him. It can't even come from the Americans. And quite reluctantly, the ground commander for Operation Overlord is made a guy named Bernard Montgomery, who's appointed to lead the British and Canadian forces under Eisenhower's command. And Bernard Montgomery and Eisenhower, to put it mildly, do not have a warm relationship with one another. Everyone might like Ike except for Bernard Montgomery. And Eisenhower, though, sees that Montgomery is going to be key to all of this, and so invites him to his headquarters in North Africa. And so he shows Montgomery the plan, and he says, "Don't you think this plan is just a little too small, particularly for someone like Bernard Montgomery of El Alamein?" And Bernard Montgomery says, "Yes, absolutely. I entirely agree it's too small." And it was a savvy move, because that in turn made Montgomery, and therefore, probably one of the most respected British generals of the era, into the face of this larger Operation Overlord. But that did come at a cost, because it created precisely the dynamic, the tension between resources between the Mediterranean and the cross-channel invasion that Churchill had wanted to avoid by committing everything to the Mediterranean. The initial invasion, as you note, was initially conceived to be a pincer maneuver. The Americans were very adamant that once the fighting in Italy had been successfully concluded, that the Allies turned quickly to the invasion of southern France to open up essentially a third front on the European continent in order to take pressure off the Soviets. But very quickly, whether or not this third front, this invasion of southern France, can continue becomes, the negotiation over the silverware in the divorce, because the Americans are completely committed to Operation Anvil. They want this invasion of southern France on the table, if only because they are wary and afraid that the British, as soon as the situation in Italy resolves itself, will keep pressing east, keep pushing to expand British influence in the Eastern Mediterranean. And the British think the Americans are being stupid, to be perfectly frank, right? The British very much understand that, if they commit everything to this invasion of southern France, that is going to prevent the British from, expanding the Allied influence throughout the rest of the Mediterranean, and would give, in essence, a far freer hand to the Soviet Union, which at this point in the alliance is, again, a technical ally of the British Empire, but it is a bit of a frenemy, to say the least, with the United States being far more willing to accommodate Soviet interests than certainly the British are. And so this does become, one of the nastiest fights that Eisenhower has to navigate. They end up even jokingly calling it within his headquarters the Battle of the Numbers, because of how much time and effort and exhaustive sort of memo writing, if nothing else, is spent just getting, landing craft after landing craft in place so that they can launch the D-Day invasion with the size that Eisenhower is confident that they need.
So we know how this story ends. You focus on this period in the lead up to D-Day and D-Day itself. You spend some time in the last chapter to looking at the immediate aftermath and it's kind of the longer tail that comes out of for Eisenhower, but somewhat putting things in perspective, not at the level of depth that you've pursued the rest of the story. But you hit on a theme that you have since elaborated in a piece that ran this week in the Atlantic about the significance of D-Day and a lot of these events and Eisenhower's role in them. And you really frame it as not just a seminal event in the defeat of Nazi Germany and Axis powers, but really in the transition of superpowers from the colonial powers, particularly English dominance, to kind of American dominance, at least in the West, in the kind of Western alliance that would emerge in the early days of the Cold War. Spell that theme out for us, pull it out for us. Why is it that you think that is, at least today, one of the resounding consequences and legacies of D-Day and Eisenhower's involvement? And how does Eisenhower's personal involvement really lend itself to that trajectory?
Sure. So I would say this, and I think the easiest way of explaining this idea is, imagine if D-Day had failed, which, even those the closest to it, including Eisenhower's own chief of staff, guessed would be, there were 50-50 odds of the invasion of Normandy succeeding. And so imagine if it would have failed. What happens in the world right after that? Well, for one thing, the United States military, and by extension the United States, is delegitimized, or all of its credibility is lost. Really before it has any, right? It's very easy to think about America as a great superpower today, but in 1944, we had been, in essence, the Plog's assistant to Great Britain throughout the fighting of most of the Second World War. And while we were a very large economy with increasing industrial and even military potential, we had never realized that potential in the cause of the Allied victories, certainly not to any great extent. And so D-Day, particularly given its improbability, proved to the world that the United States could lead a complex inter-Allied operation. There are 12 other allies, along with Britain and the United States, including a large division of Canadian soldiers who, carry out this operation. And it's America at the lead of that operation. Whereas, had it failed, America would have essentially shown itself to be a paper tiger. Quite practically, if it did fail, what were the options left to the Allies? Well, the only option really available then would be committing to the British strategy in the Mediterranean, where the air forces would continue to bomb German industrial capacity into the Stone Age, and the British Navy and the American Navy would continue to try and strangle Germany's ability to resupply. but the war would have dragged on far longer. It would have dragged on past the point, if you want to start getting into the sci-fi element of this, past the point that the United States would have developed functioning nuclear weapons. And so in a long, brutal slog with Germany that would have had to last only 3 more months after VE Day for the United States to have become a nuclear power, would the United States have dropped the bomb in Germany? What would the historic, political, diplomatic results of that have been? The land mass of Europe would have, the United States would have never been able to establish the foothold in Europe that it did ultimately in France, leaving the Soviet Union to be the only dominant power in Europe, certainly the only dominant rival in Europe against German Nazism. Would the Soviets, having seen America fail to lead the D-Day invasion, would the Soviets have cut and run and decided that it was time to cut a separate peace with the Germans in order to because they could not rely on their American allies? The number of just counterfactuals that begin to immediately crop up if the D-Day invasion had failed show how important it was in this moment to demonstrate not only that the United States had the capacity to conduct military operations on a global scale against the fiercest and most well-equipped military it had ever faced. It also was a demonstration of a new kind of use of power, because unlike the sort of Red Army fighting in Eastern Europe, the Allies were the Allies. Right? There was a kind of multilateralism to America's mission and to its efforts to liberate Europe that differed from traditional British imperialism, if nothing else. And one of the things that I think is probably one of the most notable in Eisenhower's leadership of that operation is not only his profound commitment to multilateralism, his profound sort of valuing of the contributions of the British, as well as the Canadians, as well as the Dutch, as well as everybody else to the success of the operation. But when he gives his own speech announcing the invasion of Europe, he doesn't mention the United States once. He really does view himself as an Allied commander, and he tells Europe, he tells the world that they're there fighting on behalf of the United Nations, which was not yet the organization that it would become, but was a signal that the United States as a superpower was not like the old boss, that this was going to be a different world, and all of those sort of hairy-fairy things that people like Roosevelt were talking about, like democracy, human rights, and decolonization, were now actually on the table, because America is beginning to lead the world and has the capacity to do it, and has the capacity to live up to the aspirations that it sets out.
So we're almost at time for our conversation, but I think it's worth stepping back and thinking about that kind of resident historical takeaway. Because, of course, this book is coming out on the 80th anniversary of D-Day. So there's an obvious reason to reflect on the history of the moment and recall and perhaps dig deeper and get new insights that you bring forward in this phenomenal read about those events, but also to think about their relevance today in an election year, in a period where a lot of the world order that emerged from D-Day and its aftermath is now under increased pressure and strain and skepticism really around the world, including in the United States. Given that context, what is the takeaway you hope people take from this book? What are the lessons that you feel like you've learned from the exercise of writing it and researching it that you find applicable today, and that people who are looking to this read not just for a little historical insight, but also lessons that are maybe applicable in the modern context, what you hope they take away from it?
I'd say a couple things. One is Eisenhower himself and the importance of character in leadership. And I know that sounds like a bumper sticker, and I know how that sounds, but here is someone who really did understand his place in the historical moment without trying to fill a place in the historical moment, who was able to, muster extraordinary power, not only American economic and military power, but the power of allies towards a common goal that few people thought would be possible. And certainly everyone thought that even if it succeeded, would be a bloodbath to get there. And as high as the casualties on D-Day and in the subsequent Normandy campaign were, they were nothing like the projections that just conservative planners had used in advance of it. And Eisenhower comes off, to me anyway, as a figure who's not only just profoundly interesting and complicated, but also someone who took who understood that leadership is a responsibility. And he understood that the hardest thing he had to do on a given day was make the best choice he could, right? Knowing that it could very well be the wrong choice. And he spent a lot of time trying to make sure that he was getting from information from people he could really trust, right? Who were not just toadies telling him what he wanted to hear, but also that he was keeping his own mind as clear as he could. And there are all sorts of just habits of mind that show him as, frankly, just a serious person who understands how important and how much weight actually is on his shoulders and the consequences of his decision, not just to the young men that he may very well be sending to his death, but to literally the fate of the free world. And it's someone who took that seriously, who took the grandness of his responsibility seriously, without ever giving in to the sort of narcotic enjoyment of grandiosity, which so many leaders are inevitably tempted to do. So I think just at a personal level and understanding what makes a leader and what kind of traits we should look to in the people who we put in these kinds of positions. Studying Eisenhower closely is I think, something that I would encourage everyone to do, because I do think for all of his flaws, he is someone who, was certainly in the right place at the right time. And I'm sure we could use it as well today. At the broader level, I would also say that, it is a reminder that when the United States became a superpower, the reason it could become a superpower was because it was different. Right, because it was not like the British or the French Empire, who was insisting and sort of rubbed everyone's nose in the idea that we were now the big dog on the block, and you better get along with us, or we're going to make your lives miserable. And he understood that was not just the classy thing to do, which I think is often how it's presented. But he understood that it was essential to success, because as the United States rose in its economic and military power to, new and terrifying heights, the entire world did have a choice. They could have actively resisted us, or they could have supported us. And it was, frankly, only because of people like Roosevelt and Eisenhower who, assured the world and made a point of letting the people confronted with that choice, whether or not they were in, North Africa or in China or in France, letting them know that we are not here to conquer you. Our priority is to liberate you from tyranny and to let you, decide things for yourselves, right? We believe in democracy. And it sounds super corny and cliche, and it's become that way because that was actually a radical idea in 1944. Right, when you talk about the British Empire, it was still an empire. It had expanded into a commonwealth where there was far more devolved authority to places like Canada and Australia. But it fought bitterly and continued to fight bitterly for another year or two to maintain its control over the Indian subcontinent. And so the idea that the United States would come and treat the entire world with the same respect that it gave to other peer European powers was not something that was easy to believe, but was something that by committing to, the United States was able to become, a preeminent and indeed well-liked power in the world, at least for a very long time. And I'll just add, there was a survey done that made me laugh when I read it, because it was done of the French population in September of 1944. So this is right after the U.S. Army has liberated Paris. And it is right after, it's only a few months after D-Day itself. And the French were polled and asked, who gets the most credit for winning the war against the Germans or fighting the Germans? And by almost 2-1, the French said the Russians do. And then in the same poll, they asked, well, where would you like to visit after the war? And something like 12% said Russia. And a strong plurality said, we want to visit the United States of America. And that's Joseph Nye, the political scientist, calls that soft power, but that is real power too. And to the extent we are thinking about our place in the world and how to succeed in advancing our interests, whatever those interests might be, remembering that the United States was able to rise and become the power that it is today because people wanted that to happen compared to our peers, I think is an important lesson, particularly as we increasingly have rivals around the world who adopt a much more traditional view of their own power and are seeking to delegitimize sort of the hope and opportunity that America at least promised to foster when it came into its own as a superpower in the mid-1940s.
Well, I think there's much, much more we can talk about from this period in history and this book that you have so ably put together, delving into it. We are out of time today. Michel Paradis, your new book is The Light of Battle, Eisenhower, D-Day, and the Birth of the American Superpower, out today, I believe, June 4th, 2024. Thank you so much for joining us here today on the Lawfare podcast.
Thanks so much.
The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. You can get ad-free versions of this and other Lawfare podcasts by becoming a Lawfare material supporter through our website, lawfaremedia.org/support. You'll also get access to special events and other content available only to our supporters. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Look out for our other podcasts, including Rational Security, Chatter, Allies, and The Aftermath, our latest Lawfare Presents podcast series on the government's response to January 6th. And be sure to check out our written work at lawfaremedia.org. This podcast is edited by Jen Patcha. Our theme song is from Alibi Music. As always, thank you for listening.